them. Many lizards do, and crocodilians will have them as well. That's a lizard. Okay? They're just in the little flecks of bone, in the dermis of the skin of that animal, presumably for a little extra protection. But I don't see how they offer very much in the way of protection. So those are osteoderms, crocodilians, and some lizards. I did forget an old textbook that has very good X-ray photographs of two different lizards, one which has osteoderms and one which does not. It's real obvious when you look at it. Well, I did want to say one thing. I missed it about epidermal scales, and that is that in a lot of reptiles, those scales can get modified into structures that you might not think are made from scales. So one of the jars, for example, I think we have horned lizards that are out, right? And they look like they have little horns up on their heads. But all those are modified scales, epidermal scales. Another example of modifying epidermal scales would be the rattle of a rattlesnake. So these scales can take on rather complex shapes. So that might be the shape of scales at the end of the tail of a rattlesnake. Let me do this. And as that animal grows, the terminal part falls off. But because of the structure, it can't just drop off. In other words, it is shed. The terminal scale is shed, but it can't go anywhere. And so you get a whole slew of these things. I know I'm doing it backwards. So this would be the youngest, and this would be the oldest of those three scales. This one, the youngest, would still be attached potentially to the animal. These two out here, the older ones, are simply dead scales that are remaining attached because of this sort of locking mechanism. The complex shape prevents it from just dropping to the ground. And that outer layer of scales just dries, and that's what is your rattle. So I just happen to have some rattles, and that's all they are modified scales. You can take them out if you want. So I just had forgotten to mention that the epidermal scales, which are providing external protection for the animal, also can be used for other functions. They can be modified into things like the horns of horned lizards, the horn on top of a chameleon, or the rattles of rattlesnakes. Okay. Skin. There is a difference in the kidneys as far as their functioning goes, reptile compared to amphibian. There's a shift in the molecule that is used for nitrogenous waste. Oh, yeah. Right. So we did talk a little bit about the amphibians. During development, they have a shift from producing ammonia as their nitrogenous waste molecule to urea. Uric acid accomplishes the same feat. In other words, it helps you get rid of this excess nitrogen from the breakdown of protein. But it requires less water. In other words, you can concentrate uric acid in your body to a higher degree than you can urea before it becomes toxic. What that means ultimately is that you waste less water in getting rid of your nitrogenous waste. So ammonia takes the most water. It's the most toxic. You have to continually get it out of your body, flush your system of all of your ammonia. Urea is a big improvement, but urea takes more water to get rid of than does uric acid. So it's just related to how much you can concentrate it in the body before it has toxic effects. So nitrogen, ammonia, you can't have very much. Urea, you can have more. Uric acid, you can have even more. So ammonia takes a lot of water, urea takes less water, uric acid takes even less water. And this is presumably an adaptation to the terrestrial environment. So again, you're going from an amphibian that almost always is associated with a moist environment where water is present, to a terrestrial reptile that is trying to minimize water loss through its skin, minimize water loss through its urine, because water is now at a premium in that terrestrial environment. So birds still use uric acid even. That's why reptiles and birds, when things come out of their cloaca, it's usually that white pasty material. That white pasty material often is uric acid. All right, how about the respiratory tract? We're going to have some changes that take place there too. One of the most important is that the lungs of a reptile are more complex than those of an amphibian. Again, this is correlating with the change in habitat that we're seeing. So you've got the amphibians in the moist environment, always relying on cutaneous respiration to a certain degree. Now you've got the reptiles that can't use cutaneous respiration. So they're making up for that by having a more complex lung, one with a greater surface area. So the simple sac lung of an amphibian is getting more infoldings, which produces a greater surface area. There's also a difference in how that air gets into the lungs. So if you remember with the amphibians, it was positive pressure. The animal opened up the mouth and throat area, then closed the nostrils, collapsed that mouth and throat area, and forced the air under positive pressure back into the lungs. Starting with the reptiles, though, we're going to bring the air in by suction, by negative pressure. So another fundamental change from amphibians to reptiles. So reptiles do this by changing the size of their thoracic cavity, the size of their rib cage. And they have various muscles associated with the ribs primarily that are going to do that. So when they increase the size of their rib cage, that is going to create suction, negative pressure, a vacuum, and air then will be drawn in through the nostrils all the way down into the lungs. When they relax those muscles, that will force the air back out. But the point is that getting it into the lung is now accomplished by negative pressure, muscles of the rib cage, as opposed to positive pressure in the amphibians using muscles of the mouth and throat area. We have some fundamental changes that take place in the skull of reptiles. Let me illustrate a primitive condition. This would be true of amphibians and some reptiles even. So there's the skull of a reptile. Let's take a cross section through the area that's called the temporal area. when I do so, you'll see something like this. B's for brain. These two little things down here are the lower jaw, where it was sectioned. And these are my jaw closing muscles. So we have two main parts to this skull. We have a lot of dermal bones on the outside, which forms what's called the dermal roof. And then forming much of the bottom and a little bit of the sides right near the brain is the chondrocranium. Chondros means cartilage. So this was bone that formed in that other way. There was a cartilaginous precursor that where that cartilage eventually was replaced by the hard mineral. All right. Okay, so that's the setup. This is not necessarily the best way of accomplishing things if you want to have a very strong bite, exert a large amount of force. Well, why is that? In order for a muscle to contract, it has to bulge. That's an inevitable thing that goes along with muscle contraction. Muscles need room to bulge. All other things being equal, the more muscle fibers you have, the more force that muscle can exert. But you have a situation here where your jaw closing muscles are constrained. They're in this relatively small space. I drew it very large. Small space between the chondrocranium and the outer dermal roof. So when those muscles contract, they're going to bulge. There has to be enough room between the hard dermal roof and the hard chondrocranium. There has to be enough space for those muscles to bulge. So you could add all the extra fibers you want, but if there's no room for them to bulge, if the filaments can't slide past each other, you're not going to be able to exert additional force. So you're somewhat limited in how strong your bite can be. In addition, having the muscle fibers attached just to the underside of the dermal roof or to the side of the chondrocranium, that works to a certain degree. But there are better ways to accomplish a more stronger attachment. Why do you want stronger attachments? Well, if you want fibers that a muscle that is going to exert greater force, you don't want that muscle ripping itself out of what's called its origin, the place where it attaches. Okay? So, in reptiles, there were different solutions that were independently evolved by different groups. And the solution is a temporal opening. So we're going to put an opening in that dermal roof. So there's my brain, chondrocranium, the rectangles are my jaw again, just as they were over here. But note what I've done is I put an opening in